Dannika Augustine was 9 years old when a woman sat down next to her on a beach in St. Lucia and asked if she wanted to go horse riding. She said yes. What she didn't know was that the woman sitting next to her was one of the most famous singers in the world, and that she was dying. But to understand what happened on that beach and why it matters, you need to understand where Amy Winehouse was in her life when she arrived on that island. Because by the time she landed in St. Lucia in the winter of 2008, Amy was not the person the world had fallen in love with 2 years earlier. She was not the sharp, funny, fiercely alive woman who had written Back to Black in a single surge of heartbreak and turned it into one of the greatest albums of the decade. She was someone who had been ground down by everything that came after: the fame, the cameras, the collapsed marriage, the drugs, the alcohol, the tabloid photographs that followed her everywhere she went in London. She was 25 years old, and she looked to the people who loved her like someone who was running out of road. Her management had arranged the trip as a last resort. The idea was simple and desperate in equal measure. Get Amy as far away from London as possible, put her somewhere warm and quiet, surround her with her band and her producer, and hope that the distance would give her enough space to write the third album everyone was waiting for and to find her way back to herself. They booked her into the Cotton Bay Village Resort on the northeastern tip of the island, a secluded stretch of beach where the Atlantic came in hard and the air smelled of salt and frangipani and nothing at all like Camden Town. The people who arranged that trip understood something that Amy herself may not have fully grasped at the time. Camden was killing her, not because the neighborhood was dangerous, but because it was too known. Every corner had a memory attached to it. Every pub, every market stall, every stretch of pavement between her flat and the local shop carried the weight of who she had been and what she had done there. London was a city that remembered everything, and Amy Winehouse had given it a great deal to remember. St. Lucia knew none of it. St. Lucia was just an island with a beach and people who had their own lives to live and no particular interest in hers. The early weeks did not go well. Amy arrived and immediately replaced one addiction with another, drinking with the same desperation she had brought to everything else. Staff at the resort watched with a mixture of concern and helplessness. Her management watched from London with growing dread. The recording equipment sat untouched in the villa. The album did not get written. But something else happened instead. A short walk down the beach from the Cotton Bay Resort, there was a small bar and restaurant run by a woman named Marjorie Lambert. Marjorie was a grandmother, a local institution, someone who had fed and housed and looked after people on that beach for decades. She had no particular interest in celebrity and no idea who Amy Winehouse was when the pale young Englishwoman with the elaborate hair first wandered into her bar and sat down. She just saw someone who needed to eat something. Amy started coming every day. She would walk down the beach alone in the mornings, barefoot in the sand, and sit at Marjorie's bar with a coffee and watch the ocean. Sometimes she talked, sometimes she just sat. Marjorie did not push her either way. She had lived long enough to know the difference between someone who needed advice and someone who needed to be left in peace near the water, and she gave Amy whichever one she seemed to need that morning. Marjorie would cook for her and listen to her and tell her things that her management team and her therapists and her well-meaning famous friends had perhaps forgotten to say. That she was beautiful, that she was worth something, that the noise coming from the rest of the world was not the truth of who she was. Amy, who had spent the better part of 3 years being screamed at by tabloid photographers and booed off stages and written off as a cautionary tale, found something in those mornings on that beach that she had not found anywhere else. She found somewhere she was just a person. Dannika Augustine was Marjorie's granddaughter. She was 9 years old, small and bright, and entirely unimpressed by anything that did not directly concern her. She had grown up on that beach, playing in the sand, helping at the bar, growing up the way children grow up in small communities, embedded in things, known by everyone, entirely herself. She had never heard rehab. She had no idea what a Grammy was. When the pale Englishwoman with the big hair sat down next to her one afternoon and asked if she wanted to go horse riding, Dannika looked at her the way a 9-year-old looks at any adult who says something potentially interesting, weighed the offer, and said yes. That was how it started. Within days, they were inseparable. There is a particular quality to friendships between adults and children that forms outside of any institutional setting. No school, no club, no organized activity, just two people who have found each other on a beach and decided without ceremony that they like spending time together. Those friendships tend to be more honest than most. Children do not modulate themselves for famous people. They do not treat you differently because of what they've read about you. They like you or they don't, and they let you know. Dannika liked Amy, and Amy, who had spent years being liked in the particular conditional way that fame produces, liked for the music, liked for the image, liked as long as she was performing and falling apart in the right photogenic way, found in that uncomplicated affection something she had not known she was missing. Dannika would arrive at Amy's villa in the mornings, and the two of them would move through the days together, swimming in the pool, sitting on the beach, playing games, talking, laughing. Amy called her daughter. Dannika called her Amy. They went horse riding along the beach with the ocean on one side and the palm trees on the other, and the whole island spread out around them in the particular golden light of the Caribbean afternoon. People who saw them together said they looked like a family, not a famous person and a local child, a family. What those people noticed most was what was absent. When Amy was with Dannika, the drinking stopped. The desperation that usually sat just behind her eyes went quiet. She was present in a way that she was rarely present anywhere else, focused, tender, entirely engaged with the small human being in front of her, rather than with the wreckage of her own story. Dannika would say years later, with the directness of someone who had spent a long time thinking about it, that when they were together, Amy was always clean and never sad. She was never drunk or taking drugs because she wanted to be responsible. She wanted to be someone Dannika could rely on. And for the first time and longer than anyone could remember, Amy Winehouse wanted to be responsible for something outside herself. It was Marjorie who first used the word that everyone was thinking. She told people that she saw Amy as a little child who needed help, but she also saw something else. She saw that in looking after Dannika, Amy was looking after herself, that the love going both directions was doing something that no amount of professional intervention had managed. It was keeping her present. It was giving her a reason to stay inside a day rather than trying to escape it. Amy herself seemed to understand this. When Dannika's mother Nadia thanked her one afternoon for the time and attention she was giving her daughter, Amy stopped her. She looked at her and said something that Nadia would repeat for the rest of her life, the kind of thing that only makes complete sense when someone says it and then is gone. She said, "Dannika is taking care of me." The months in St. Lucia produced fragments, a handful of songs sketched out in the villa, rough recordings that suggested what the third album might eventually have been. She performed at the St. Lucia Jazz Festival in May 2009, a difficult night, not her best, but she was there, she stood on the stage, she sang. She was trying. The island gave her something to try for. The months in St. Lucia also gave Amy something she had not had in years, a version of ordinary life. She went to the market. She sat on the beach without security. She ate at local restaurants where no one asked for photographs. She gave £4,000 to a man she met on the beach who needed money for a medical operation, quietly and without announcement, because the thought of someone not being able to afford something they needed struck her as straightforwardly wrong, and she had the money, and he needed it. That was Amy in those months, stripped of everything the industry had built around her, and revealed, underneath all of it, as someone with a good heart and nowhere useful to put it. She returned to London eventually, as she always did, and London gave her back the things St. Lucia had taken away: the cameras, the noise, the weight of being Amy Winehouse in a city that had decided what Amy Winehouse was and watched constantly to confirm it. The drinking came back, the album stayed unwritten. The years between 2009 and 2011 moved the way those years moved for her, in cycles of brief recovery and longer collapse, in moments of extraordinary grace and longer stretches of darkness. But she went back to St. Lucia, more than once. She went back to the Cotton Bay Resort and to Marjorie's Beach Bar and to Dannika, who had kept growing while Amy was away, and who received her each time without judgment, without the weight of everything that had happened, with the simple, uncomplicated love of a child who was glad to see someone she missed. In her last visit to the island in late 2010, Amy was quieter than she had been before. The people who saw her then said she seemed tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. But she was still herself when she was with Dannika, still present, still the person that the little girl on the beach had decided she was: kind, funny, someone who gave good hugs and kept her promises and showed up. Before she left for the last time, Amy told people she wanted to bring Dannika to London. She talked about lawyers, about processes, about what it would take to make it official. Whether those conversations would ever have become anything real, no one can say for certain. What is certain is that she meant it, that the love she had for that child was not a performance or a distraction or a famous person's passing fancy. It was one of the truest things in the last years of her life. There is a version of this story in which everything turns out differently, in which Amy goes back to St. Lucia one more time and stays, in which Dannika grows up in London and Amy grows old watching her do it, in which the third album gets written and released and becomes what everyone who heard those St. Lucia recordings believed it could have been: evidence that the voice and the honesty and the singular talent were still there, intact, waiting. People who loved Amy have spent years living with that version. It is the cruelest kind of grief, the kind that comes with an almost. Amy Winehouse died on July 23, 2011. She was 27 years old. Dannika Augustine was 10. When the news reached St. Lucia, Marjorie Lambert sat down on the beach where her granddaughter had first met the pale Englishwoman with the big hair, and she cried for a long time. Dannika, who was 10 years old and had just lost the closest thing to a second mother she had ever known, tried to understand something that no 10-year-old should have to understand. Years later, Dannika would speak about Amy in interviews with the careful, deliberate language of someone who had spent a long time making sure she got it right. She said Amy was like a mother to her, and that when she died, it left a gap she had never been able to fill. She said she thinks about her every day. She said she believes, and this is the part that stays with you, that if she had gone to London, if she had been there, she could have saved her. Not because a 10-year-old child has the power to save a grown woman from addiction, but because when they were together, something in Amy quieted down, something in her settled, the part of her that was always running went still. Dannika Augustine grew up. She finished school and graduated, something that mattered to her in part because Amy had always asked about it, had always wanted to know how school was going, had spoken about education with the particular urgency of someone who had left formal schooling early and occasionally wondered what different decisions might have produced. She became a chef. She had a son of her own, a boy she is raising on the same island where she once went horse riding with a woman who called her daughter. She said that when she looks at her son, she sometimes thinks about Amy, about what she gave her, about how it felt to be loved like that,
completely and without condition, by someone the rest of the world was watching fall apart. The Amy Winehouse Foundation, established by her family after her death, has worked with young people across the United Kingdom ever since, reaching those who are struggling with addiction and the kind of internal chaos that Amy knew from the inside. It is her name on that foundation, but the people who knew her in St. Lucia would perhaps recognize the spirit behind it just as clearly in a beach bar on Cas en Bas, in a grandmother who cooked for strangers and told them they were beautiful, in a little girl who showed up every morning and asked if anyone wanted to go somewhere. What the world saw in those years was a woman in crisis. What Dannika saw was someone who, on a beach in St. Lucia, with the Atlantic coming in and the afternoon light going gold, was capable of being something the headlines never captured. She was capable of being a mother. And for a small girl growing up on a Caribbean island, and for Amy herself in the last quiet years of a short and extraordinary life, that was enough. That was, perhaps, the truest thing she ever was.